students, how are you? Wish you are all safe and healthy, and welcome again to our online session. Today's lesson will be about states of matter. So as we have learned before, matter is everything that has a mass and takes up a space. And actually all matters around us, all objects around us are made up of tiny particles that are in constant motion. So everything and anything around us actually is made up of tiny particles, and these particles keep moving. So the chair you are sitting on, for example, the pencil you are writing with, all these are made up of tiny particles. Even the air that you are breathing, even though that you can't see the air, but actually air is a kind of matter that is also made up of tiny particles, and these particles keep moving. So as we know, matter usually has three main states: the liquid state, the gaseous state, and the solid state. And actually the state of matter is determined by how much particles move and how often they bump into each other. And actually the motion, or the different motion of the three states of matter depend on what, guys? Depend actually on the arrangement of the tiny particles that each of these states are made of. So again, the arrangement of the particles for each state of matter is different, and this arrangement will result in different motion and different properties. So for example, let us start with the first state of matter, which is the solid state. And here we can see the tiny particles that made up this kind of solid. So if I ask you to describe the arrangement of these particles, can you give me a brief description for this arrangement? Okay, yes, thank you. Actually, as we can see, particles are closely attached to each other, and we can see that there is no spaces between these particles. And actually because of that, the particles of this solid matter will not be able to move past each other, since there is no spaces between these particles. And because these particles cannot move past each other, then we can say that solid has a definite shape. So solid has a definite shape. Why? Because the particles of solid cannot flow. The particles of this solid cannot move past each other. Why? Again, because there is no spaces between these particles. So again, all solids have a definite shape. So what about the volume of solids? Do you think that solids have a definite or a constant volume? Actually, to answer this question, we should again consider the spaces between the particles. And as we said, there is no enough spaces between the particles in solids. That's why the particles of solids cannot be compressed. They cannot be compressed and they cannot be expanded, and that's why solid considered to have a definite volume. So for solids, all solids actually have a definite volume and a definite shape. So now let us move to discuss the second state, which is the liquid state. And if I ask you to describe the arrangement of the liquid particles, what can you answer? Okay, yes, we can see that there is small spaces between the particles of the liquid matter, and still these particles can touch each other. So if we need to discuss about the volume and the shape of the liquid, whether if the liquid has a definite volume or not, or if liquid has a definite shape or not, again we need to consider the arrangement of these particles. So now, as we said, because we have some spaces or small space between particles, we would expect that these particles will be able to slide or move past each other. That's why liquid can easily flow. As we know, if you pour out, for example, a certain amount of water on the surface of a table, for example, we can see that liquid can flow for a certain distance easily. Why? Because, as we said, because there is more spaces between the particles of the liquid state. So because this liquid, or the particles of this liquid, can slide past each other, then we can say that liquid actually doesn't has a definite shape, and actually liquid will always take the shape of the container. So what about the volume of liquid, guys? Again, can we compress the liquid easily? Actually, we cannot compress or expand the liquid easily. Why? Because the spaces between particles are too small. So that's why liquid actually has a definite volume. So again, liquid has a definite volume, but it doesn't has a definite shape, and it will always take the shape of the container. Again, why? It's because the arrangement of the particles, and it's all about what? It's all about the spaces between the particles of the liquid state. So now let us move and discuss about the gaseous state. As we can see here, the arrangement of the particles of the gaseous state, and we can see that the spaces between these particles are very big, and we can see that the particles are moving freely in all directions. So because of that, actually gas doesn't have a definite shape and doesn't has a definite volume. Why? Because the spaces between particles are very big, which will allow the particles to move fast and to move freely in the space that it will occupy. And as we know, because the spaces are very big between particles, it will be easy to compress the gas, and that's why gas actually doesn't have a definite volume. So again, for a solid actually has a definite volume and a definite shape. Why? Because there is no spaces between the particles that will allow the particles to move past each other, or to be compressed or expanded. For liquid doesn't has a definite shape. It will take the shape of the container, but at the same time it does has a definite volume. It cannot be easily compressed. For gas doesn't has a definite volume, and at the same time it doesn't have doesn't have a definite shape. Why? Because the spaces between the particles are very big, and these spaces will allow the particles to move fast and to move freely in all directions. And now let us have this question, dear students. What state of matter is shown in the image below, and how do you know? So what do you think? Is it the liquid state, or the solid state, or the gaseous state? Okay, well, yes, this is the gaseous state. Why? Because as you can see, the spaces between the particles are very big, and the particles are moving in all directions. That's why this image represents the gaseous state of matter. So that's all for today, guys. Thank you, and see you tomorrow, inshallah.